So we just got Andor episode 9, and once again we had an intense episode that serves as a setup for what's going to be explored next week, probably the prison break and the Empire's search for Luthen. Now this episode focused on 3 subplots: Mon Mothma, Dedra and subsequently Cyril, and Cassian's prison story with Kino and Melshi. Now the running theme throughout episode 9, Nobody's Listening, was the sheer brutality of the Empire, and Toby Haynes did not shy away from showing us the brutal reality of surviving under an authoritarian regime. Now at the end of episode 8 last week, Bix was taken in for questioning by Dedra, who's now the ISB supervisor on Ferrix, and as I predicted yesterday in my episode 9 preview, we saw Dedra interrogate and torture Bix. Denise Goff told us that after this week's episode, we'd have no more sympathy for Dedra, and she was absolutely right, because until this point, admittedly, we've been rooting for her, but she turns out to be just as extreme in her ideals as the Imperial regime that she serves. Now what's really interesting about these interrogation scenes, where the acting is fantastic by the way, even in Cassian's absence, his actions have cast a dark shadow over the people he knew and loved, and the residents of Ferrix on the whole. Bix does her absolute best to resist Dedra, who not only wants intel on Cassian's whereabouts, but also the whereabouts and true identity of Luthen, who she calls the buyer, since he came to Ferrix for Andor under the guise of wanting a fractal radio unit. Now the Empire simply calls Luthen Axis, and interestingly enough, Luthen doesn't make a single appearance in this episode, yet is the focus of so many plot threads, including Mon Mothma and Vel, who in this episode we find out are cousins, but more on them later. Now as with many sadistic Imperials, Dedra relishes in the fact that she has Bix right where she wants her. But Bix realizes that no matter what answer she provides, Dedra won't believe her. It gets to a point where she brings in the sinister Dr. Gorst to torture Bix, and I've got to say that scene was directed amazingly. To create a haunting and disturbing visual effect on the audience, they didn't show us what Bix was hearing. All we got were her torturous screams. And as I say guys, this all proves what Denise told us, that Dedra Meero is not just an Imperial woman in a man's world, a fascist in a world of fascists. And this show, and this episode more specifically, is demonstrating the fear that the Empire instilled in residents on various worlds. Everyone, and I mean everyone, was a victim of this regime. Now something very disturbing during the torture scene is what the Doctor explains to Bix. During the Empire's colonization efforts, they encountered a sentient species on an Outer Rim moon called Dyson Frey. The nature of the creatures there led the Empire to grant officers permission to use any means they desired, which prompted the massacre of the Dysonites. The Empire used this tragedy as an example to other sentient species to fall in line, and this actually goes back to something that George Lucas talked about in the 80s, that the Empire is pretty much all human because they were speciest and elitist. Now even darker about the Dysonite massacre is what they did to the children, and in this episode we have a masterfully edited transition from Bix's screams to the prison drills on Arkina 5. Now let's talk about Cassian. Back at the prison, he is still getting on day by day, as he and his fellow inmates continue to be literal cogs in the Imperial machine. Now as we know from the Making Star Wars leaks, what they're building are parts for the Death Star. Quite ironic given how Cassian would later die on Scarif because of the Death Star's laser, which he now technically is helping to build. And the most important part of this subplot is that he realizes that the platforms the officers use to bring down new prisoners are not capable of frying them. One inmate says that anything that moves can't fry. So during the times they're bringing in new inmates is the perfect time to attack, and that's when Cassian has the epiphany that the Empire is not as smart as they seem. They're even more manipulable than he thought. The plan of escape, he thinks, might be more straightforward than he assumed. Moreover, the title of this episode is what Cassian tells Kino and Melshi, that the fear the Imperials instill in the inmates is just fear. Quote, "Nobody's listening." Now while at this stage in the episode a full prison escape seems very unlikely, they're laying the groundwork for it, and a great first step was Andor cutting that pipe. So when it comes to Bix's interrogation, Dedra Meero commands that they keep her alive. However, at the ISB headquarters, they seem to have pieced some information together. Although her proposition at first is not taken too seriously, Dedra Meero tells the ISB that she thinks Andor is linked to Aldhani and the attack on the garrison, because the information they've gathered, as her assistant says, is that he was clean-shaven, returned to Ferrix with a fortune before departing, and his description matches the other rebels who also partook in the attack on the garrison on Aldhani. It's all coming together, and despite her brutality, Dedra Meero is certainly talented. Dedra also reveals that she chose not to question Maarva, Cassian's adoptive mother, because she was too old and frail, but they are going to use her as bait to trap Cassian later on. And so now guys, let's talk about Mon Mothma. We cut to her in the Imperial Senate, pushing back against Palpatine's public order resentencing directive, but no one is on her side, as each planet representative turns her proposal away, but she fears that they're moving in the direction of unquestioned authority, but that is something the Imperial worlds are happy with. It was always Palpatine's goals, and the Imperial Senate is nothing like the Democratic Senate of the Fallen Republic, but Mon Mothma is still learning that slowly. Mon's driver informs her that her cousin has arrived at her apartment, and the big reveal is that this is Vel. And in retrospect, Vel does have a certain Chandrilan aesthetic about her, but it could just be her accent. So the two discuss the rebellion and the deal they both agreed to with Luthen. Vel is clearly mentally much more committed to the more radical side of rebellion than Mon Mothma at this stage, but worried that suspicion will arise, Mon Mothma suggests that Vel reminds the world of her spoiled rich girl facade. Later on, at the dinner table, Perrin being, well, just Perrin, makes a comment to Vel about needing to find herself a husband. And this is very ironic considering her relationship to Cinta. When Vel leaves, Mon Mothma is seen speaking to Tay and trouble has emerged. It looks like it's not going to be possible to get funding through. People will ask questions and suspicion will arise, but the one person who can help them is a certain banker called Davos Golden, who Mon Mothma clearly doesn't like and calls a thug. We again have another breakfast table scene on Coruscant at the Khan residence. Another back and forth between Syril and his mother Edie ensues. Syril breaks the news to her that he's been promoted at work, but what she's not aware of is it was just to keep Syril quiet about putting in requests regarding Andor, and again, the mysterious Uncle Hollow is mentioned. If you want to hear my thoughts on who Uncle Hollow might be, you might want to check out this video I posted last week. Syril stalks Dedra, and she runs into him on her way to the ISB headquarters. Dedra accuses him of stalking, which he is doing. Syril comes across as a fanatic, saying he just wants to be in her presence, and that he realised life was worth living when he did so, and he even says that he wants what she wants. Dedra pushes back, but as Carl Solar and Denise Goff teased, there is a sexual chemistry there, a tension that's not been realised yet. Dedra pushes back and tells him he's crazy and threatens to have him arrested if he continues to pursue her. So after shaking off Syril, Dedra makes her way back to the ISB headquarters, where she discovers they've captured one of Krieger's men near Steergard. Now Anto Krieger was mentioned in the last episode, and is someone that Luthen works with, but is a partisan that Saw Gerrera can't stand. During the Clone Wars, Krieger was a separatist. Using the same tactics they used on Bix, it's revealed that Dr. Gorst managed to get the pilot talking, and he revealed that the rebels had plans centered around Spellhouse. At the end of the episode, back on Narkina 5, rumours begin to make the rounds concerning Level 2. Apparently the whole level got fried for, quote, making trouble, and the realisation that something is up finally hits Kino, who the entire time has been holding on to hope for his freedom, but as Melshi said, they might never get out. But of course in the timeline we know they do, at least Melshi and Cassian, who both appear later in Rogue One. Everything comes to a head when Olaf has a stroke and dies after a doctor inmate is called and administers a euthanizing injection to put him out of his misery. Now Kino pushes to learn what really happened on Level 2, and it turns out an inmate who already was released accidentally returned to the same floor they'd been working on, and so out of fear of being caught for their mistake, the Imperial officers fried the entire floor. And the episode ends with a frightened and vengeful Kino who finally answers Cassian's question from earlier. How many guards are there per level? And the answer is 12. And so now Kino is ready to help Cassian stage their escape. I've got to say guys, this episode was really brutal. We see what made the Empire so vicious and cruel, an oppression on a completely different level. It was beautifully written and directed, and so for me, this episode gets a solid 9 out of 10. But what are your thoughts guys? How would you rate this episode? What are your thoughts, and where does it go from here? Share your thoughts in the comments down below guys. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give me a big fat thumbs up, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one. May the Force be with you always.